Great. Hello again. Continuing a follow-up from the Zoom session we did this morning. I promised you I would do that and record a bit of a voiceover. I didn't want to keep you more than an hour this afternoon, so I'm not adding anything, but I'm just probably going to give you a little bit more detail. So I'm not going to cover this too much because we've already done that. That were the objectives of the Zoom session itself. I think we've achieved those. So on the importance of ethnography, so it is really, I think, important. I can't stress this enough that when we approach both actually integration of technology and online teaching, we actually we meet the students where they are, so that we do this sort of groundwork where we find out what are the tools they're using. So first of all, obviously, what are the devices they're using, and usually it's going to be mobile, and then what are the softwares that are already loaded on their mobiles, so that you're not forcing them to reintroduce themselves to software that may not be the one they're used to. It may require a lot of time on their part to get competent on these software. Also, simply imagine that if all of us are choosing different software, the students are bombarding and having to switch from one platform to the other all the time. It absolutely makes no sense. It gets very frustrating. I think we've also got to accept the fact that the life expectancy of most products out there in educational technology are very short. The socioeconomic sort of history behind it is that a lot of these companies that start up, usually they're free. That's usually where we make the most of them because they're free and they're available to us and our students without licensing fees. And then if they get very popular, they get sold to a multinational, and then obviously you start to having to pay for them. So it has become a bit of a routine in the last 10 years that educational people who use educational technology do it for that phase when it's free and then abandon the product afterwards. So this makes the problem much worse for students because it's not even as if you're introducing them something that is lifelong, it's going to stay with them. Everyone has an understanding that it's a short-term software solution, and that therefore, why should you invest so much time in immersing yourself in so many of them, where really, it would be easier to work from the ones that the students have tested already and they've already downloaded on their phones and they already feel competent and familiar using. If you're interested in disability and accessibility, this is really, really important for students with disabilities as well. Because for about 10, 20 years there, we were using assistive technology software packages that were extremely expensive, like Zoom, like JAWS for students with visual impairments, a lot of reading softwares. They were standalone sort of software products that we were adding to the students' sort of hardware and asking them to get competent on. And then there were many, many problems with compatibility of these software with the software that were there. Things have changed. Many of the sort of major players have now decided that it's important to have an accessibility suites within each product, particularly Microsoft and Apple, but also Android phones, which means that often now students with disabilities, including very significant and severe disabilities, will have software which is free, which is mostly consisting of apps, things that they have tried out, that they like, that they're working with. So the process is the same with students with disabilities. Often now it's a matter of actually asking students, what do you have, and actually working with them from that. I was teaching at Mont St. Vincent at Halifax for a while, and the accessibility services there have completely changed their modus operandi, and they don't actually provide services in a traditional way at all. What they do now is simply meet the student, ask them to bring their mobile, look at what software they're already using, and then supporting them on understanding how they can optimize the use of those apps and that software for accessibility within the university program. So in both those dimensions for students with disabilities, but also for any students that you're actually teaching online, make the step to actually get to know what they're using. It's going to be very, very important. It may seem something counterintuitive for you because we are not great at ethnography in the classroom. As I said before, we are made to feel through our training and through our experience and through our peers that really we have to talk more than listen. We have to direct more than follow. and that we are responsible for all for the class management. And so the very act of stepping back and listening and asking people open-ended questions about their habits and their preferences is something that we're not used to do, and something that you're going to have to teach yourself to do, because that's the whole sort of process of ethnography, and it will pay off. And I really can't recommend this enough. You will find out an awful lot for engaging in conversation with your students. So it's a change of shift in mindset that needs to happen. Designing for learners' habits and preferences. So we've talked about, when I talked about universal design for learning, I talked about user experience. And it's going to be very important, again, when we devise for online learning, that we actually take the time to think about the user experience. So I've talked quite a bit already about the notion of device divide rather than digital divide. It's going to be very, very important that that we actually take the time to look at who uses what, for what reason, and for what purpose. Why are they using? The majority of our students, the great majority, and almost the unanimous voice of our students, that they're using mobile technology. Well, it's intuitive, it's cheaper, it's smaller, hyper personalized, as I said on the slide, less conspicuous, more convenient. So if you're interested, Pew Research in the US does a lot of research, really, really significant sort of longitudinal data sort of research on a lot of key issues in society. They focus, a lot of their research focuses on the use of technology, and they do some great stuff, and often they include Canada in their analysis. So there's some great sort of data coming out of that. So never forget that. I can't stress it enough, that mobile accessibility to content from a mobile is not the same as from a tablet and a computer. Especially as we looked at gamification, when you choose games, when you choose videos, when you choose these sorts of resources, it's going to be really important that you test them out on the mobile. It doesn't require much. Again, it's user experience. It requires your willingness to step away after you select and choose, and to actually try it out on a mobile and see whether the experience is what you thought it was. This is a real problem for higher education. Higher education, although the data has informed us for years and years that that's the way our students mostly access information. In all aspects of university communications, we tend to stick to large screen sort of formatting, which is really problematic. So when I worked in accessibility, we try this out, try and look at the websites even of universities, and how many of these websites don't have a mobile format option, and therefore you are not seeing the full screen. A lot of the options are not available to you. There are things that you can't play, things that you can't see. So it seems like a small detail, but it's the cause of an immense amount of frustration on the part of students when they're confronted with things that are clearly not working because they've not been designed for the size of their screen and the sort of are used through mobile technology. Avoid the danger of structuring reflections around specific products. So I think I've spoke about that deception quite a bit, but I will repeat just the essence. What we see a lot, and I have been working with teachers and instructors in the integration of technology for quite a while now, is that even when you have a class specifically on technology, you will see that instructors tend to arrive with products and wanting to discuss product. And that's the last thing we should be doing. All of our discussion should be around the goals that we're trying to achieve, where technology fits in, but in a very generic way. So what do you want that technology to be able to do? What do you want that software to be able to do? Try and keep it in those terms, because that's going to enable you, again, with all these short-lived products, to be able to replace the one you have by another one without any issue. See, I'm filming from Screencastify. I would never build a teaching practice around Screencastify. Actually, before that, I had a software, I think that was called OneNote. And one day I, logged in. It was great. The same, I could record my face and record the PowerPoint. One day, and it would transfer very easily to MP4s. One day I tried to click on as I was preparing for a class, and the software was no longer available. In that case, it had actually gone bankrupt. It hadn't been sold. But that's usually what happens to it. If they don't get bought out, they just go out of business overnight and stop existing. So my focus is never going to be about Screencastify. My focus is going to be about finding something that allows me to talk over my PowerPoint while you being able to see me, and then being able to transfer this into files that are manageable in size and can be uploaded directly to Moodle or then to YouTube. And if my reflection has been framed in this way, When that software is no longer available, it doesn't matter, because 1 hour after OneNote had gone out of business, I went on to Screencastify. It was easy to do Google search and find something equivalent that was free. At the time it was free. Now I pay $25 a year, but that would able to fill the gap and actually do the same thing. So I really encourage you to do that. Never start from a brand. Never even start from the specifics of a product. Start first of all from the design. What are the outcomes you're trying to reach? What is the software that you need as an affordance? What is it going to allow you to do? Try and define and formulate what you want it to do, and then go look for a product that fits that purpose. And then when that product is not available, you can go back to that process you had, look again at what is it that you want that affordance to be able to allow you to do, and then you can find another product as replacement. So that's going to be very important. The second point was very important, and we'll come back to this in section 11. We keep talking that we're in a business model in a neoliberal environment. We have to be vigilant. We have to take this back to an ethics discussions around our allegiances and our loyalty to big tech companies. They are, you know, very useful to us. There's a lot of things that are offered to us for free. It's very easy to start relying on them, but we've got to be very careful that we don't build a loyalty that makes us their brand ambassador, because it's not a matter of being cynical, but it's the reality of the business plan behind these companies is that they appeal to the teachers, and then the teachers themselves are creating a brand loyalty in us, in your children that are going through school and in the students that are going through college. So we should never put ourselves when we become agents of multinationals that are selling tech. And you've got to be really careful that you never become over dependent on one company or on one product. And it scares me immensely when I see, for example, K-12 teachers that are building their entire pedagogy around Google Classroom. Because if you take that brand away, their strategy is no longer there, no longer exist. They are wholly dependent on the product itself. And it's a position we should never find ourselves in. In higher education, it's less frequent, but even so, we should be, very careful not to become over dependent. There's a bit of this happening in terms of the platforms themselves. So there's Canvas, there's Moodle, and Collaborate that are fighting for this. Moodle has the great advantage that it's a sort of do-it-yourself platform that has never been geared, and that's why universities like it so much. It's never been geared really as a sort of a plan that you have to buy in and buy maintenance for and be tied in for years. Some of the other competitors like Canvas have had a very different model, and universities have had to be very careful and step back a little to not become wholly dependent on them. So in all of those things, all these platforms and all these tools, you're always going to want to keep a bit of a critical distance. I think it's really, really essential. What else did I have for you? Yeah, and I spoke about this section too, but technology is the affordance, not the driving. It's not in the driving seat, right? So back to the allegory of being the tool, not the master. You've got to be very careful of this. Really, all the approaches that we've looked at, constructivism, experiential learning, social constructivism, some of these sort of practices that we've looked like gamification. There's an intention behind it. You are trying to reach a certain goal using a certain philosophy. That should always be your starting point in design. Once you know where you want to go, you're looking back to what are some of the activities that you might want to use to reach that goal. So what I'm describing now is backwards design, right? You start with, and so instructional designers do all the time when they support us. You start with your goal and your outcome. You then work backwards and look at an activity which would be suitable depending on the level, depending on your community, depending on the understanding of students. You select that activity and then you work backwards, and then you select in a form of assessment that shows that the goal has been achieved after having practiced and taken part in the activity. So, see, there's no technology involved there. The technology is actually going to be your affordance. So, in parts of that process, technology is going to be useful, and that's where you're going to include it and squeeze it in. But the essence of your design process should not be reliant on technology, because it is a tool. It's not a key element in your backwards design sort of reflection. And in terms of accessibility and inclusion, I've talked about this too. Be very careful. And here I was saying that UDL and backwards design fit in well, because as you are going backwards and you've got your outcome, you're looking for an activity, you're also going to look at activities that are as flexible and as inclusive, and maybe you're going to create several activities. That's where you're going to create the multiple pathways so that students are able to complete these activities. And then in the assessment too, you might want to include some diversity. So you've kept that backwards design structure, and then at each level of the activity and assessment, you're creating diversity and flexibility so that students have multiple pathways to get back to that outcome. So not too tough to merge and to sort of make UDL and backwards design fit well together in that reflection. The TBag I've talked about, so I'm not going to talk too much about it. What I'd just like to add is that there's an abundance of literature. I don't want to bombard you with readings because you have a ton of readings in this course again already. It's also because I think TBag is interesting. So if you're curious, definitely go and explore it, and you're going to find a lot of literature on it. Also, just a ton of websites. So if you don't want to read a full article, you're going to find a ton of great little websites like the ones I've listed here for the reference as a source for the diagram. It's an easy enough concept to understand. It's a useful framework. It's very intuitive. So when you look at it, you imagine say, I think, yes, a great theoretical way to sort of frame some of the difficulties you probably experience. In that sense, it's really helpful, I find, for instructors, for them to create a mental schema of these multiple skills that they have to develop at the same time if they want to get to that happy place in the middle. But at the same time, as I said, it has its limitation because it never gives you practical solution. It's more of a lens to look at your difficulty and your process, and to enlighten you on your roadmap towards better integration of technology. But it doesn't give you specific solutions. Right, it's just a lens. But have a look. I think you're going to find it interesting. And the notion of blended. So there's a lot of passionate sort of debates out there about what is best. Is it online? Is it blended? There's very little clear data, and the reason why there's very little clear data is because most of the studies, again, first of all, it's because simply of the theoretical lens that the authors adopt. So depending on whether they adopt in critical theory or constructivism or something like that, one of the two may be more appealing in essence without even looking at that empirical fact. But it's also because a lot of the studies that are trying to prove the success of one versus the other are not taking into account social economic factors, cultural factors, history and size of the institution. Again, here I'm taking you back to something which is a constant sort of refrain that you're going to hear from me, this importance of going back to an ecological perspective. Often you cannot argue the pros and cons of a phenomenon if you're not looking at the variables that surround it. And all of these variables are going to have direct impacts on whether something is successful or not as a learning, as a teaching approach. So trying to argue the benefits of and the pros and cons of online teaching versus blended teaching is never going to be conclusive if you don't actually reflect that complexity, contextual complexity that's around. But if we look at the last sort of 15, 20 years before the whole COVID sort of chaos, it's very clear that the blended model sort of comes forward as something which is creating more satisfaction on the part of learners and more perception of success on the part of instructors, and also a sort of manageability from the institution point of view. So it seems to be a recipe for success. As much as there's a recipe for success, there's always pros and cons. But in terms of looking at the big challenges, blended learning seems to be a nice compromise that allowed all parties and stakeholders to seem to get what they want. As I've said, some of the most convincing examples I've seen were fairly old, now 10 years old, studies around very large quantitative studies that were done around nursing programs in Queensland and Australia, which back then already were already blended, which means there were short sessions where cohorts would meet together, and the rest of the time the students would be learning remotely using mobile technology. That was very important. So blended learning with the user experience element of always making sure that the online components were actually sort of mobile compatible. And these were all about professional programs like yours. So I think that's definitely interesting for you. A lot of great stuff has been done around nursing education. I've given you a reference there. You've got enough readings already, but just if you ever want to come back to this and you want to explore more, there's a lot of international research on blended nursing programs. and they seem to be very convincing in terms of offering a sustainable solution that appeals to all stakeholders. I think, as we've discussed this afternoon, the great thing about the blended learning is that it tackles the issue of social canvas and therefore social capital theory, the notion of creating those networks and enriching those networks, something which is quite separate from the cognitive part itself or the construction of knowledge. So construction of knowledge is maybe an argument that it can happen online, it can happen blended, that in fact, if we adapt and we tackle things differently, the outcomes might be reached just as well in either. But I think the selling point for blended learning is the social capital. So this notion that quite apart from your construction of knowledge, quite a part of your of the cognitive part of learning, we are also in education to create networks and to enrich our networks. And that if online learning can to some extent try and create those connections, but they will never be as rich in terms of networks as they are when you have blended networks. And really, if you're interested in this, it mirrors a lot of really interesting literature around social networks. People have been now looking at social networks, both condemning them, saying they're superficial. You have 3,000 friends on Facebook. What's the point? That it doesn't represent anything tangible. But on the other hand, it's also showing that, in fact, a lot of those social connections that are created virtually lead to some very tangible and real connections that eventually happen face to face. The first sociologists to actually look at this were people looking at gaming. We had a great presentation on gamification yesterday. It's always interesting as an instructor to keep a look on gaming, because you have very different people looking at gaming. It's not education scholars, it's sociologists that are looking at that. And as a field, sociology is maybe more wider in scope. And so there's been a great deal of really interesting studies that have come out of the study of gaming from the year 2000 to 2010 there. And of course, as you know, gamers can play randomly with people in other countries, people they've never met. But those scholars looking at gaming were the first to argue that, in fact, a lot of these connections did become real. And of course, there's all the famous examples of gamers who end up getting married and or living together and moving to a different country as a result of connections made online. Now, obviously, it's a little fraction of the enormous amount of fairly superficial connections that we make, but they are nonetheless real, and they lead to a very direct impact in your life. And I can give you other examples as well. There are many people that I've met through Twitter, for example, and I've established a relationship, professional relationship with them through Twitter. And of course, you have thousands of people that you meet on Twitter that you will never get to know, but a percentage of these connections definitely translate into very tangible face-to-face professional relationships that are increasing your social capital. These are people that sometimes I've met in job interviews, that I've met in other contexts, and that I originally had met on social network. So all this to say that this notion of blended learning as being the optimal solution sort of mimics this process, because you have people that you are meeting online, but eventually in the program, and even if it's very small windows, you are meeting them face to face. So it's sort of taking these these virtual relationships, but it is very securely and convincingly turning them into face to face sort of tangible networks that can have the potential to become very rich. And that's why blended learning is so interesting from the social capital theory point of view. And again, I would say that it's probably not cognitive. I'm not sure that there's any study that can prove that really one is more effective than the other in terms of knowledge acquisition, in terms of construction of knowledge. But it's more on the social capital theory sort of aspects that a difference can be made. And again, this is the recipe you're being offered for the fall. So I think go forward confidently that you are being given the optimal sort of recipe for success, and that there should be a lot less challenges with that format than an online format only. So I hope this was useful, and I will stop now because it's already getting quite late, and then I will put some instructions for the next section, which is on open, so it will connect quite a bit with this section. And then we have a guest speaker, my colleague Bonnie, who wasn't available during section 8, but she will speak to you on the Monday, I think, just after this section finishes. So I wish you a good night, and I'll speak to you very soon.